transcript as well if you need to turn that on, anybody. So that's great. Sorry, just admitting more people as well. There's a lot going on this morning. But yes, we've got the recording running now, and that will be able to be circulated afterwards as well for anybody who hasn't been able to make it along. So yeah, do feel free to ask questions at any time today. There's a lot to get through, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of queries that are raised by some of the stuff we look at as well. So feel free to either drop those in the chat or unmute yourself and let me know you've got a question. Got a lot of windows to juggle this morning, so if I do miss any questions, do feel free to unmute and shout at me if they're timely, because I don't want to overlook anything. So yes, we will. I'll be happy to try and answer anything you want to throw up as we go along. So yeah, the chat, you can also use that for general conversation, or sharing any resources that any of you have seen as well. And as I say, we will circulate the slides and transcript and recording in the coming days. So without further ado, let's have a look at the agenda. This is what we're going to be looking at this morning. We're going to be applying accessibility principles to documents. We're going to be creating accessible templates in Word and creating accessible content with Word. We're going to touch on PDF accessibility, but I understand that a lot of you will be only working in Word, and there's very few of you that actually have Acrobat Pro and would actually be doing accessibility work within that, and that's fine because the balance of what you're going to see this morning is very much Word focused anyway. And as I'll probably mention later, we always advise that you do the accessibility work in that original document, in that Word document, because the last thing you want to do is be doing it at the last minute in the PDF. You want to get it right from the start for reasons we'll come to later. So yeah, I don't think that'll be a problem. We will do a little bit on PDFs though towards the end, and we'll also look at forms right at the very end as well. Just touch on those briefly for if anybody's doing any forms in Word or PDF, and give you a bit of advice around those. So that's the agenda. Now I'm going to share a few links here just in case you want to look along. You don't need to by any means, but I'll just put those in the chat. Hopefully those are coming through okay. And those are just some example documents that I'll be sort of fiddling around with during the presentation at various times to show you different bits and pieces. So if you want to look at them yourself to see what I'm on about at the same time as I'm showing it, then by all means do open those, but they will also be circulated with the slides and everything else that you get afterwards. So it's completely up to you whether you want to grab those now or not. But they're in the chat if you do. Oh, excuse me, need some water. Right, okay, so I'll just give you a little bit of background to accessibility standards before we get into what this really means in the world of documents. So just to touch on this very quickly, the international accessibility standard, the most kind of recognised one is called the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, which is, I don't really think it works as a word, but we all insist on saying it anyway, so I should probably do that for the rest of the morning, sorry. WCAG 2.1 has been the standard for a long time, but actually 2.2 was published a month or so ago, and I'll talk briefly about that in just a second. And level AA, so that there's three levels of WCAG. There's the single A, which is kind of the basics that everyone should be trying to do. There's the AA, which is that plus a little more, and there's AAA, which is, I kind of think of it as like a stretch goal. If you can do some of those things, that's great, but at least you've provided most of the things that people need if you're doing AA. So that's why AA tends to be the standard that you'll hear most about. That tends to be the one that a lot of the regulations and international agreements and stuff are aligned to. There's an example there of a European standard that's aligned to WCAG 2.1 AA, and that actually has a section about non-web documents. As you'll have gathered from the W there, it is kind of web targeted originally, but it has expanded over the years to encompass mobile apps and things like that as well. And certainly lots of the principles in it can be applied to documents. And in the UK, as I expect many of you will be aware, and certainly it was my sort of gateway drug to this world, the public sector bodies accessibility regulations, that regulation came in maybe 5-6 years ago now, and that requires all the public sector digital output effectively to be compliant with, at the time, WCAG 2.1. And actually, what's happened now is that last month, WCAG 2.2 was published. It formally became the recommendation in October 2023, and that means, because of the way the public sector bodies regulations are written, that's now actually the standard that the law aligns to as well. But the Government Digital Service, who monitor compliance with all that, will actually not be monitoring for any 2.2 specific stuff until a year after it was published, so beginning of October next year. But actually, the good news for today is that I didn't really need to update any other slides, because the 2.2 changes don't really apply to the document stuff that we're going to be looking at. There is one particular thing around target size. In other words, if there's a button or something in your document that people need to interact with, you want to make sure that's as big as possible, basically. And the actual detail of that we don't really need to worry about for today. But that's really the only change that's going to be monitored for in a year's time by GDS. So that all the standard stuff out of the way, let's think about some accessibility principles first of all. So this is how WCAG is broken down into these four principles, and they are easy to remember because they start with the letters of a word, which has nothing to do with accessibility, but POUR, P-O-U-R. So perceivable is the first one. It's very important that all your content can be perceived by all your users, and that's regardless of which senses they may or may not have. So, for instance, you need to be sure that, you know, blind people. Oh, I've got a message. The slides are not changing on screen. Is everyone else able to see the slides okay? They're coming through all right?
Yes.
Yeah, they are. Okay, it might be worth maybe dropping on and off the call or something like that, Joshua. Sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, so perceivable. It's about actually being able to perceive that content at all. So we're thinking around things like images, for instance. If you need to be able to see what's in an image to understand your content, then you need to provide a text description of what's in that image in order to make your document be communicated clearly. So that's what perceivable is all about, and there's other nuances around that as well, you know, color blindness and things like that, which we'll come to. Operable, that's the second. Oh, I'm glad to see that it's working now. That's great. Hopefully it will start working for a couple of others that were having the same problem. Sorry about that. Yeah, operable, that's where things actually need to be interacted with and used in various ways. So perhaps filling in a form or opening a new window or something like that. It needs to be able to be operated by all users. So for instance, you shouldn't rely on someone being able to click things with a mouse or jab things with their finger. It might be that they're only using a keyboard or they're only using some other assistive technology to interact with a document or website or whatever it is. So you need to make sure that you cater for all those users. So that's what operable means. Understandable, that's more about, can the content be understood? In other words, is it, you know, maybe you could look at the plain language around that, though a lot of that kind of falls into the AAA level of WCAG, but obviously no harm doing it. But also there's things like, is your interface explained clearly? You know, can people tell what they need to do to use your document, use your form, use your website, whatever it is, and maybe understand if they've made an error and how to fix it, that kind of thing. And the final point there, which is a bit more of a techie one, is called robust. And that's around the actual kind of coding standards behind your website or your document or your app or whatever it may be. Is it coded to good standards so that all the different technologies out there that people may be using will reliably work with it, and it will kind of hold up to those standards. So that's robust. And I should say, when I mention assistive technology, the thing that I guess a lot of people think of when you hear about accessibility is screen readers. And for those who don't know, that's where somebody who perhaps is blind or has very low vision may have their computer read things aloud to them. And that's absolutely one of the most important forms of assistive technology, and one that a lot of our accessibility techniques will cater for. But there are other assistive technologies out there, and they may be to do with mobility issues. Perhaps somebody doesn't have the dexterity to use a mouse or a keyboard, and maybe they're using a pointer that's on their head or something like that. So there's lots of other assistive technologies out there, but generally speaking, that's the sort of umbrella term for it all. So if I talk about that, that's kind of what I'm talking about. Okay, so talking about those 4 principles and how they apply to documents, remember some documents will convey information visually. I mentioned maybe an image, so you need to make sure that that's perceivable through assistive technology such as a screen reader. The document may be interactive, so like I said, they need to be operable if it's got forms or links or things like that. They may request user inputs, again, that would be more of a forms kind of thing. So they need to minimize user errors as part of that understandable principle. And different types of document will have different levels of support for different assistive technologies. So choosing the correct document format will influence the effort to make it accessible. So we'll have a quick look at that in a minute. The characteristics of accessible documents, these are some of the things we're going to look at in more depth today. And these are some of the things that you really need to have there as part of your document if you want it to be accessible. So the first thing I'll mention is searchable text, and this is really a fundamental thing. You may, I guess we all do it at times, you share a screenshot, don't you, of something you've seen on your phone. That can sometimes filter up to people actually embedding a screenshot in a document of maybe a table that they want to share or a spreadsheet or something like that. But that screenshot doesn't contain real text, it's just a picture of text from a different application or whatever. So that is not searchable text. What we're talking about with searchable text, which we'll come back to a little later, is what I would call real text. So that's one characteristic that we'll look at. Navigational aids, bookmarks, headings, tables of contents, just ways for people to find their way around a document. Metadata, which I always think is a funny word, but it just means things like the title and the document language, sort of the properties of the document, if you like. Programmatic document structure sounds a bit geeky, that one, but it just means things like the tags that explain what the structure of the document is, how the parts of the document relate to each other in a kind of way that assistive technology can understand, and then communicate to its users. Logical reading order as well, make sure everything is communicated in the order you would expect through from the start to the finish, and interactive form fields that can be used with a keyboard, alternative text for non-text elements, that's that image point again, which we'll come back to, and appropriately formatted tables as well. Tables can be quite a complex area if they're not done right, but luckily there are some good tools in Word to help with that. So let's have a look at the kinds of formats that you can have of document. Oh, someone has a blank screen now. We're not having much luck with the the screen sharing today, are we? I'm sorry about that. I think if people are having these problems and sort of leaving and rejoining is not fixing, I'm not quite sure what to suggest other than watch back on the recording, which hopefully will have the screen, the slides there. So I'm sorry about that. But it looks like it's hopefully fine for most people, fingers crossed. So in terms of the types of document format, there's Office and other editable formats, such as Word, that we'll be looking at today. There's PDF format, and that's kind of historically that's kind of print focused. You know, it can't be resized and reflowed and stuff like that. It's just kind of designed to look how it is and be printed. And there's also the more modern kind of EPUB and HTML based formats. HTML is what you would find websites created in, and that's a really good accessible format for the most part. PDF, arguably the hardest to make accessible, and Word kind of somewhere in between. There's a table there of lots of pros and cons, which we don't really need to dig into in any depth today, but you're welcome to sort of refer to afterwards when you get the slides. But yeah, I would say that's the general kind of hierarchy. PDF can be quite hard to make difficult, particularly if you haven't done the work first in Office. If you get the Office document accessible in the first place, then PDF suddenly becomes a lot easier to make accessible. And yeah, the HTML web page EPUB formats, they can be pretty good. They're probably the best for accessibility, generally speaking. Again, if they're done right, as with all these things. So let's have a look at Word templates now then, and we'll get really into the sort of why you're here part of the session, I guess, for the next hour or so. Now we'll get into all the detail of what to do to improve the accessibility of Word. So first of all, we're thinking about the templates here. So if you're providing templates or creating your own templates for the kind of work that you're doing day in, day out, these are some of the things to consider. So let's think first about styles. And one of the things, I think one of the big differences that you can make to using Word and other software as well. I don't know if anyone here uses InDesign, for instance, to produce documents as well. If you're in comms or somewhere like that, you might do. But it's this same thing. It's using styles rather than just manually changing the formatting of things, because those styles can have additional information embedded in them, and that's particularly relevant with headings. So if we switch over now to actually, I'll just touch on the other couple of things there because we're going to come to them in more detail in a minute. So I'll jump ahead to the next slide then. So we'll come back to headings in just a second. But normal text as well. You want to apply good styles to your normal text to make it maybe be quite well spaced. Maybe look to around 1.25, 1.5 times the height of the text. You want to have the line spacing to make it nice and clear to read. Maybe don't have justified text, have it left aligned if possible, as that's easier to read as well. And have bulleted and numbered lists we'll look at in a bit more depth in a minute as well, but use the built-in functionality for those basically in Word. So yeah, on the heading stuff, let's have a look at this in a real Word document. Let's go over to this accessible example. So this is, I think, one of the documents that I shared earlier, or a similar version anyway. And this has these heading 1 and heading 2 styles. You may have spotted these up here before, but a lot of people don't really use them. You'll just be like, well, I want a heading. I'll just make the text big, maybe make it bold, maybe change the color. That tells you visually that it's a heading because you've made it big and bold and a different color, but it doesn't tell anyone programmatically, it doesn't tell assistive technology that that's a heading. So the way to tell assistive technology things are headings is to use these built-in styles. So this is a heading 1, and that means it's kind of the main heading of the whole document. Most documents you're only going to have one heading 1 in, and then this is a heading 2. And that tells you that it's kind of a subheading of the main document. So it's the next level down, and it's that structure that you're trying to build here. And the best way to see that structure, I think, is if you go in the View tab and you turn on the navigation pane, you'll see this panel will appear on the left here, and that will actually show you that structure. And it's kind of like a tree structure, if that makes sense. You can expand and collapse, and you can actually see then that the levels are correct. So good use of Microsoft Word and considerations and table demonstration and additional resources, they're all at this kind of heading 2 level. And that's because they're all kind of the next most important level down, if that makes sense. They all nest within that main document. Whereas something like table demonstration has another heading under that called upcoming training topics. And that is a subheading of table demonstration. So that's another level down. That's effectively heading level 3. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of what we mean by a document structure. And the reason that this is important is that users can navigate documents by that structure, and it really helps people jump around the document and understand, you know, a bit like you might with chapters or an index or something like that. So this is one of the really important things to get right at source when you're first creating that document, is to think about that heading structure. Now, what you might be thinking looking at this, and it's certainly something I've thought in the past when I'm looking up here, is they're not very attractive heading styles. I don't really like the look of them, and that's not what I want them to look like. So if I press that, it's going to turn it that, it's going to look ugly. Not sure about this. So if that's where you're coming from on this, don't worry. There's a couple of easy ways to change that style. And the great thing is, if I demonstrate this with heading level 2, you'll see that it will automatically then apply to all the other heading 2s, and that's the other advantage of styles more generally. So there's 2 ways to achieve this. One is you can right click on heading 2 in the styles kind of gallery thing there, and you can modify. And in here, you've got all the different settings and styles that you could ever want to apply. You can also see what heading level it is there, just to confirm. But generally, don't change the name, and then you won't forget what level it's at. But yeah, you can do all that through there. But personally, the way I find easier, I guess because I've come from that background of just changing the font to whatever I want it to look like, and then only finding out about accessibility later. If I change that now, suppose I want my heading to be purple and bold. There we go. So that's my new heading level 2 style, but I've only changed that in one place here. But if I now right click on heading 2 and I do update heading 2 to match selection, that's it. That heading 2 style has now taken exactly what I just did there in the normal kind of formatting way, and it's applied it to all the heading 2s. So that's a good way to apply, you know, whatever look you want for your styles, but without losing that underlying meaning of, you know, this is the structure. And don't forget, you can always check that you haven't messed up the structure by keeping this navigation pane over here, or just opening and closing it to check from time to time. So that's the structure stuff around heading levels. And yeah, it says they don't use headings only for visual styling as well. I suppose the counterpoint to me saying, you know, I think they're a bit ugly, you might not want to use them kind of thing, is the other way around, is if you see that and think, oh, that looks really nice, I want to just put this random bit of text in the middle of my document in that lovely blue font there. Don't do that, because you'll have a heading then in the middle of your document, and that's going to confuse people because it's not meant to be one. So yeah, it's kind of the flip side of what I was saying before, really. So yeah, font style, size, style, and color is the next point to look at here. We would always argue for at least a 12-point text if you can. That's quite a good default size for most users, to be honest. But the good thing, if you're sharing your documents in Word format rather than converting them to PDF, it's very easy for users to change the font size and color and anything else that they like to whatever suits them. That's one of the advantages of the format, really. And okay, it means they won't be looking at the document exactly how you designed it, but it will meet their needs better potentially, you know, if they can do that. So it's that balance really between how much you want to enforce your way of looking at things versus how much you want to give them the control. So that's perhaps an advantage of Word. Avoid overly decorative fonts and continuous capitalization. We would sort of say a sans serif font is typically the easiest one to read. And when we say sans serif, we're talking about things like Arial, as in this slide. There's no little fiddly lines on the end, which are called serifs of the text there. They're very clean, kind of straight serifless fonts, basically. Sans serif. Yeah, so that's the kind of clear font that you would ideally use. Though, as I say, again, users can customize that themselves if it's a Word document you've shared. And the final thing I'm just going to mention on this slide is about color contrast. And this is where we find out where the color contrast analyzer wants to behave today. Yes, it does. Often it hides behind the slide and refuses to come in front of it. But today we've got a color contrast analyzer. So this is a free tool that you can download from the link that you'll get in the slides when they come around. And this lets you pick, with this little eyedropper here, it lets you pick any color from your screen and any background color from your screen and confirm whether it meets the contrast requirements. These are straight out of WCAG. So 4.5 to 1 is the color contrast you want to be aiming for. And if you've got very large or quite large and bold text, there is a sort of exception that says it only needs to be 3 to 1. But I would say wherever you can, just do 4.5 to 1 anyway, and then you haven't got to worry about that nuance. And you know you're doing a good job, basically. So I'll tell you what, rather than just switch back to Word, let's just do it from the slides here. So I'm going to select that foreground color there. Oh dear, I'm sorry to hear that someone's missed a few minutes because the depot fire alarm went off. That's unfortunate. You'll have to catch up later. Sorry about that. Sorry to hear that. Yeah, so background color, this is white, but we'll just double check. There we go. Those color codes you might recognize if you've ever seen any sort of HTML color coding for websites, but otherwise you can actually change how this appears as well to things you might have seen in more like Word, RGB and stuff like that. But of course, you don't really need to worry what it's saying there. The important thing is to check down here, what's the contrast ratio? And in this case, as you'd hope from MobilityNet slides, we have passed quite comfortably there. That's significantly above 4.5 to 1. And that's all explained. If you expand out, you can read more details about the exact WCAG requirements. But yeah, that's a really useful tool. And I think I'm always surprised, particularly if I don't know if any of your branding has orange involved, but I would say orange is the most surprising color. Sometimes you get surprised by this. You think, well, that's clearly visible. And then you do the color contrast and you're like, whoa, it's 2 to 1 or something, very low. So yeah, always worth checking, particularly if you're starting with a new color combination in your document. Make sure things are perceivable. So that's a bit on color. And finally, in this section around templates, decorative content. So headers and footers in your document. Again, without switching away from Word, you get the idea. This kind of thing up here around how to create accessible documents and my name and the date. That kind of header information that you can have in your Word template, that will be hidden from assistive technology. And that's actually what you'd want, because if you've got a multiple page text document, what you don't want is every time the new page starts, that flow to be interrupted of someone reading that information by your header. And so but the counterpoint to that is you shouldn't put anything in the header and footer that you need people to know is there. So you can't put unique information in the header and footer. So as with this, all the information in the header on these slides is straight from my addition to my initial slide at the start of the presentation. So it's not like there's information in the header and footer that you won't otherwise have. So yeah, that's why you tend to restrict it to things like page numbers, which assistive technology will take care of that. It will know what page you're on just by how many pages it's gone through. And yeah, titles and other information that's kind of there on that title page of your whole document, that sort of thing. So yeah, make sure stuff like that is using the built-in header and footer functionality, so that they don't get read out every time someone jumps to the next page, because that will get very annoying very quickly. Background images, we're going to look later at how you mark graphics as decorative graphics, but that would certainly be the case with background images. You're not going to want the watermark or the background picture or border or something like that to be communicated every time someone starts a new page. So make sure those are always marked as decorative in the way that we'll show you later. So I'm going to just pause there now and just see if there's any questions coming in. Has anybody got any questions so far? Do feel free to unmute if you have, or drop them in the chat. If not, I will admit that was also a good way for me to catch breath and have a bit of water. And I will now move on to this next section. So I will keep an eye out though, so do keep dropping the questions in if you have any. So now we're going to look in even more detail at stuff in Word. So we've covered the kind of those high level template things, but what do we need to consider when we are thinking about the content of our Word documents and what we need to do to make that accessible? So we've kind of broken it down into 8 areas here, which are, I guess, of more and less likelihood to appear in every Word document. Certainly text is going to be in pretty much any Word document you care to imagine. And images, quite likely as well. Tables, you may well have some of those. I know in my local government days, we did love a table. So I'm sure you've all got plenty of those knocking about that you want to include in your documents. So yeah, tables and links as well. You may well have some of those for people, particularly when you're circulating these things digitally. Chances are you're getting a link to other parts of your website or whatever else. Lists and headings. We've already touched on headings, but we'll also look at lists as well. Quite common to have bulleted or numbered lists, perhaps. Form fields, if your documents are for people to fill in or complete, then those need to be accessible. Media, perhaps less likely. I guess not many people tend to embed videos and audio in Word documents, but it is possible. So you need to keep that in mind if you are doing that. I don't think we will really be looking at that in any depth today, because it's so rare that people would include that in a Word document or a PDF. But there's certainly considerations around that. And if anyone's got any specific questions, do drop them in the chat, and perhaps we can round them up at the end. And charts as well. You may be putting charts in your documents. We'll touch on those a bit later as well. So first of all, then, what do we mean by accessible text? I started to touch on this earlier, and the key thing here is that it is real text. It's editable, it's copyable, selectable, searchable. It is actual text. It's not an image of text, and I think that's the thing that's been slightly concerned as more and more people have got familiar with screenshotting, from sending memes around to their friends and things like that. We have seen a bit of a rise in people screenshotting things with maybe snipping tool in Windows and dropping those into documents, but those are then not searchable, they're not text, they're not accessible. So if you need to copy stuff from one place to another, you do actually need to kind of select that text, copy it, paste it, reformat it however it needs to be formatted to look like how you want it to. And yeah, it needs to be not an image basically, so you do need to have real text there. So yeah, if there's a few ways to check for that. And an example there is if you do kind of select all text, which you can do usually with like Control A or dragging and selecting, and copy and paste that maybe into a different document or into maybe Notepad, because Notepad only supports text. Then you can see if that all comes through. And if there's a big chunk of your document missing, then that chunk probably isn't real text. And you want to investigate that. But typically you can kind of tell, you'll know if it's an image or text when you're scrolling around and clicking around. So yeah, watch out for that. Lists. Let's talk about lists now then. What can we do wrong with lists? So I'm going to look at both my Word documents here. I'm going to look at the accessible one first of all. Let's find that again. Here we go. So what we've got here is we've got a list and it contains multiple items here. And they've got these kind of bullets that are made of ticks. Let's just zoom in a little bit more. And this is a proper list. And you can tell it's a proper list because as soon as my cursor's inside it, this list button has got that kind of border around it. It looks kind of pressed in. And that's because this has been built with the list functionality. And this is the list section of Word up here. You've got your bulleted list, your numbered list, and your very complicated lists that always go wrong, but they're meant to work. the multiple level, you know, you've got Roman numerals and all sorts in there. Yeah, so those are your three ways of doing lists that are correctly marked up effectively. They're correctly communicated to assistive technology as being lists of items. So you can use things like the I've just turned it off being a list, sorry. If you do the little drop down there, you can choose the formatting of the list. There's a tick built in, there's various other ones here, slightly strange arty one there and some diamonds and all sorts, but you can also define new bullets as well. You can choose other symbols from other fonts if there's a particular thing you want. Maybe it's a list of crosses instead of ticks or something. You can find that through there if you don't like the look of any of these default bullets. And numbers similarly, you can choose what kind of numbers you want, and those will be numerical lists. So that's what to do it right. But just to show you the kind of thing that we're talking about that you won't want to do, if I go and find the bad document, here we go. You can see that what's been done here is that these are just big pictures of ticks. They don't have any alt text, which we'll talk about later. This whole document is riddled with problems, as you'd imagine from a demonstration bad document, including the whole document's marked up as a table. This isn't a list, this is just a paragraph. You can see this button's not pressed in. So yeah, there's no kind of semantic information to tell users this is a list, there's maybe 5 items in it, this is the first item, you know, all that kind of stuff that visually you can just see by looking at the page. You can see, oh look, there's a load of there's 5 things there. They all look similar, it's a list, and you just kind of, you don't even consciously think of that really, but it's one of those visual cues that you can take for granted as a sighted user, but it needs to be communicated to users who can't receive that. So yeah, that's why we say that it's really important to make sure that all your lists are marked up as such. And yeah, I mentioned about the formatting there. So that covers that off. And yeah, you can adjust the paragraph styles as well. We looked at styles earlier, and you can use those for your lists as well if you want them to be spaced differently, things like that, as well as just changing the bullet. Language. This is an interesting one. There's a couple of considerations around language. I guess that you're mostly dealing in English documents, but there's a couple of things here. One is if your whole document or the majority of your document is in a different language, you want to make sure that that's defined. I'm guessing by default your language is going to be set to English anyway, but you would go to review language preferences, and you would set that to be whatever language your document was primarily in. But if you've got a portion of text in a different language, that's where you need to use the language button on the review section there and set the proofing language. But while you've got that text selected, so you might highlight the phrase, you know, je ne sais quoi, and highlight there and go in there and set it to French. And the reason for that, and this does really come down to largely to screen readers anyway, is that when a screen reader is reading stuff out, if it comes to a different language that's not English, but the system is telling it is English, it will try and pronounce that phrase as if it was English. So I don't know why I went with that example, but as I've said, je ne sais quoi, I guess it would say, I don't know, je ne sais croix, or, you know, something like that, wouldn't it? It wouldn't be able to pronounce it correctly because it would be trying to do it as if it was English. So that's going to be quite a confusing experience for users. So yeah, if you do a bit of a niche case perhaps, but if you do have other languages in your documents or overall documents, then it's worth setting that to make sure that that's accessible. Right, alt text, here's a big one. So we're talking now about images, and you may have heard the phrase alt text. It comes up quite a lot in when you're considering accessibility, because I guess it's quite an obvious thing. You know, if there's an image there and you need to understand what's in that image to understand your document, then you need to have alt text, which will explain it. It's short for alternative text or text alternative. So what I would say, this is my number one tip around alt text. If you were reading your document over the phone to somebody, what would you say when you got to that image? And there's a couple of branchings off from that question. One is, yes, if the image is conveying something meaningful, then you would probably explain what it said, and you'd probably try and keep it succinct, which you should with alt text. You should always try and keep it as succinct as possible, as long as it is conveying the meaning of the image. But the other branch from that is if, when you were reading the document over the phone, you would not even mention that that image was there because perhaps it was purely a decorative image, just a picture of the streets of northeast Derbyshire or something when you were talking about the latest news or something like that, then that's probably not actually conveying any information, and you probably just gloss over it on the phone and not even mention there was a picture. In that case, that's what you'd call a decorative image, and that's where you would be ticking that mark as decorative box that we've got down there. So let's go and pop into the inaccessible Word document for a minute, and I'll use this example over here. So this is a little picture of someone writing on a piece of paper for some reason, and that at the moment has no alt text. Now, where this panel has come from is you can right click on your image and you can do view alt text, and that's what opens this panel. And if you're dealing with a lot of images, you might want to kind of leave that open all the time. Then it gives you really easy access as soon as you click the image. It says here 1 to 2 detailed sentences recommended. I think that's a little bit subjective, but the key principle is to keep it as succinct as possible and kind of front load the most important information, because users may want to skip past when they've heard the key thing about it. So in this case, I mean, if that was a meaningful image that you would mention on your hypothetical phone call, then you might type in here, you know, handwriting with a pencil on paper, and that's your text, or your alt text. But actually, in this case, I don't think you would mention that on the phone. I think that's just an illustrative kind of thing to break up the flow of the document. And so what we would be doing there is we would just be ticking mark as decorative, and we would move on. The other button you might have noticed there is this button called Generate Alt Text for Me, and this is very interesting actually when we deliver this this particular course, to see how AI has improved each time. The recording I was watching of this course recently from only about a year ago, it was truly awful. The alt text it generated was something about a graph. I mean, that's not a graph. It didn't mention there was a hand. It didn't mention there was a pencil. I think now it's slightly better. A hand holding a pen, really close to what the picture actually is. But the point is not just to be disparaging about that button or about AI, but the point is that it's unlikely to ever truly know the purpose of that picture being there. So yeah, it might be able to now detect that that's a hand holding a pen, but it doesn't know if that's actually a decorative image, which is what we decided it was. So unlikely that that button will ever generate something you can use, but by all means give it a click, see what happens. But you've got to still review that, and you've got to still think, is that actually what we're trying to convey here? So in most cases, you're probably not going to be using that button. The other thing to say, we'll come later to the accessibility checker, but the accessibility checker gives you a good way. If you've got loads of images, as I'm sure there are in this document that don't have alt text, the accessibility checker will give you a good way to just see all the ones with no alt text in a nice little column and just go through them one at a time, dealing with them. So that's another way of doing it. But if while you're actually creating your document, you want to be doing them as you go, really, because you'll have in mind what the purpose of your image was. So that's again through right-clicking the image and doing view alt text. Okay, so let's move on to charts. Oh, that slide's disappeared, hasn't it? Where's the slide gone? There it is. Yeah, so charts and smart art. So this is a thing in Word around, I think, doing, you know, funny letters with shadows and all that kind of stuff, isn't it? Now those are, they're kind of exposed. If users are using Word, these things can be exposed in a little more depth to them in their assistive technology, which is great. But for alt text, and particularly for when you're going to export to PDF, where none of that's the case, what you'll want to do there is actually replace the kind of interactive smart chart and smart art with pictures of themselves and then apply alt text to that, because otherwise you might find that the PDF contains lots of different slices of pie charts and numbers and stuff that don't really make sense out of the context of that chart. So yeah, if you're exporting your Word document to PDF, put the chart in as an image. But if you're sharing your Word document as a Word document, by all means leave them as smart art, leave them as a chart. That's fine. And yeah, we're back to the alt text thing here as well. So you need to be giving them alt text regardless of the format, whether it's a chart or an image. You want to give it alt text. And in this case, so this pie chart is probably about the limit of how far you'd want to go, where you would actually explain everything that's going on in the pie chart. You know, you've only got 4 things to convey there. It hasn't got a title, strangely, this chart, but you could assume, I guess, that that's the grades for some students in a particular year or something like that. So let's say that that's what it is. So then you would probably give that as the first part of your alt text, and then you could feasibly say 58% got grade A, 23% got grade B, and so on. But if there was a lot more slices than that, what you'd start to look at is what's the overall kind of image that you're trying to convey with or purpose that you're trying to convey with that image. So in this case, it might be over half our students got grade A this year, but you do want to provide as much information to users of assistive technology as sighted users have got there. So you'd be looking to try and include the data table behind that somewhere in your document, ideally nearby, but if not, at least mention where it is, you know, see Appendix A, see Appendix B, whatever, for the full data, something like that. So that's the considerations around charts, is just make sure the information's all available, but don't try and cram way too much into the alt text, because it's really hard to kind of navigate vast quantities of data if you're just getting it in one lump as a piece of alt text. So yeah, that's where that longer description thing comes in. So that's where you'd be looking to have it in text nearby or in an appendix. Use of colour. So we looked at colour contrast earlier, and that certainly comes into play here as well. You want to make sure that wherever you're using colour, it has good contrast. But what we're talking about here is making sure that the colour is not the only way that information is being communicated, and that people don't need to be able to perceive colour. As I'm sure you know, there's lots of people that are colourblind, or may just have very low vision and not be able to distinguish colours clearly. So there's an example there of a chart about men and women. Men are the blue line, women are the red line, but they're not just blue and red. They also have different shapes all the way along them. So that means that users can then distinguish between them by something other than colour. Now, it's not to say that you don't want them to use colour. You know, by all means use colour, because that can be of great benefit to a great number of users. You can very quickly see at a glance that that's men and women, but you do need to provide that additional way to be able to tell those apart. That's where the shape comes in. And we've got another example there with links. Links, I'm sure you know, links are generally underlined, aren't they, on websites and in documents. But you do often see people think that looks a bit ugly or whatever, I'll turn off the underline. The problem you've got then is that the link is then only being communicated by colour, and if you couldn't really perceive the difference between the black text and the blue text, you would not really know where a link was, and you'd be constantly moving your mouse around trying to find, is there a link, where's the link? So we would generally recommend keep the underline on your links. There is a little bit of nuance in WCAG around this use of colour thing, which I won't get into in too much depth, but just to say, if you really can't find any other way than just between colour, than just colour to distinguish between things, make sure those colours are as contrasting as possible, and you can use that tool that I showed you earlier. And as long as it has more than 3:1 contrast, and the higher the better, then technically you're not failing WCAG, because that you can then say people are relying on the contrast rather than the colour. But I would say that's a real kind of last resort fallback if there's really no way that you can do it with some other indication. So yeah, just try not to rely on colour at all, basically, as a way to tell things apart. But there is a kind of a workaround if you really can't avoid it, and that's just to ensure contrast. And speaking of links, as we were just then, there's a lot of users will, particularly where they're using something like a screen reader or other assistive technology to help them navigate your document, users will want to know where the links are going to go without necessarily being able to see the full context of those links. So what you don't want is a lot of links that say things like click here and read more, because that doesn't tell you where the link is going, or you often just see the word here as a link, even though the text just before it has explained exactly what you're going to get if you go here. So actually the text before it would have been the appropriate link. So try to make sure that your link text, which is what you can see in this text to display box, is succinct but clear about where you're actually going to end up. Now, this screenshot example is not the best, because I would say that the best text to display there would just be the word Google, because that's the website you're going to be taken to by a link which goes to this address. The additional complication, I suppose, that you've got here with documents is that you may envisage that some people are printing out your documents, and clearly if it just says Google, they're not going to know. I mean, Google's a bad example, we all know how to get to Google, but they're not going to know where to go, you know, what the URL is if you've hidden it by replacing it with the word Google. So our advice around that would be, I mentioned front loading before. Front loading is quite a good concept in accessibility. It's where you put the information that people most need first in any given element, like a link or a whatever I was talking about before when I mentioned it, alt text. Yeah, so you put that first. So in this case, what I would recommend, if you were envisaging lots of people printing this document, you could put in that text to display Google first, and then in brackets the URL, and try and keep that URL as short as possible. So don't include things like HTTP, blah, blah, blah. People don't typically need to type that in their browser to get there. They just need to type google.com probably. So you could put Google brackets google.com, and that could be your link text. And then you've got kind of both bases covered. But generally speaking, the principle is to try and just keep it to meaningful text and not include the URLs unless it's completely necessary to do so. So that's with links. Tables. Okay, we're going to have a look at tables now, and we'll go back to the document in a minute and see a real example, because it's a little bit more complicated with the tables. But there are really good features in Word for handling what I would call basic tables, I suppose. You can get to a point where a table can have too many layers of headers and stuff like this, and it can get too complicated and you can't really make it accessible in Word. So that is one of the downsides of Word as a format. It can be fixed in PDF afterwards, but it's quite complicated to do that. So the good principle with tables is to try and keep them as simple as possible, and that's good for all users. You know, they can be quite hard to understand if they start getting really complicated. So when we talk about a table, the ideal table has a set of header cells at the top, and maybe a set of headers at the right as well that apply to the rows, and then every single item in a column is kind of interrelated. It all relates from the top to the bottom of the table to what that header cell said at the top. So maybe name, and then the whole way to the bottom of that table is names. And if you find that a table changes meaning halfway through, that's when you need to be breaking that into two tables, because that's not really the same table anymore if it's changed meaning. So tables need to be consistent all the way across and all the way down. And if your meaning, the meaning of a row changes or the meaning of a column changes, then that should be broken into multiple tables. So that said, that's about what you're actually structuring into a table. How do you make that accessible once you've made sure it's a proper table, as I'd like to call it, you know, a meaningful table. Oh, we've got a question about reading order, even though the table is not simple. That's interesting. Let's talk about that once I've shown the table demo. We'll just have a little pause and we'll find out what you mean exactly by that error, because I'm not sure what the context of the error is. If you want to provide any more info while I'm demoing, that would be great, just around where you're getting the error from. That'd be really useful. Okay, so let's have a look at a real table, which I've put. I think I've added this to this document, so you may not find this in the links that I sent earlier. Sorry. But here we go. We have a table. This will come around afterwards. And this table is, like I said, it's a nice simple one. So the left-hand column relates to everything to the right of it, and the top row relates to everything below it. These are all durations, these are all dates, these are all topics, and these both relate to the word presentations. So that's what I mean by a simple table. And then there's some important settings that you need to do for the table. First of all, because this table might break across multiple pages, and you can't really be sure when a table might suddenly do that. If you suddenly add in some earlier content, things like that, it could affect where it breaks. So it's always worth doing this. Select the first row of your table, go to table design. Oh, sorry, missed out a step, apologies. So table design, this is for the whole table. First of all, we're going to say that we've got a header row and the first column in this case. Now, almost all tables are going to have a header row, and a lot of tables will have a first column. So chances are you're going to want to tick both these boxes. And when we say first column, we mean a first column that describes things to the right of it, effectively a header column. But I guess they didn't want to confuse things by giving them both the same name. So yeah, if you've got that header relationship with the data, then make sure that you've ticked both of those. There, and you can see also there is total column and last column, total row and last column here as well. So that's for more kind of mathematically financy kind of tables. So you may want to tick those if it does have a total row at the end, or a last column, which is similarly, a summary of everything to the left of it. So those are the important things to set for your table based on those headers that we were talking about. But yeah, what I was about to say was, in terms of the table breaking across the page, if I select that top row and I right click and go to table properties and then go to row, I want to do repeat as header row at the top of each page. And that ensures that as the table breaks, it repeats that same header row. So that's not actually a row that I can select or do anything with, because that's just a repeat from the previous page. And that's automatically done for me then. And then that means if that table gets broken up in a PDF format, as can sometimes happen, at least it's always got that data relationship then, as well as just being visually nicer. It's easier for people to see what the columns are if the header repeats. So that's a really important one. And the other one is then across the whole table, you want to go back into that table properties and you want to make sure that allow row to break across pages is not ticked, because that can cause real accessibility problems, particularly when you are converting to PDF. If a cell gets broken across page, then that cell might end up as two rows basically, where it should only be one. So you're then getting half the cell read to you there, and then you go on the next page and you get the other half read, and it's just very confusing and doesn't actually mean what it should mean. So yeah, important to make sure that the cells don't break across pages. And there is also, you may have spotted when we were in here a minute ago, there is the possibility to add into the table properties some alt text, and there's no harm in doing that. That's quite nice. It will give assistive technology users a way to understand the purpose of that table overall. In this case, probably just be much the same as that previous header, but yeah, not essential, and I don't think it takes across to a PDF. So you probably, depending, what the destination of your document is, but if you're sharing it as Word, then it's worth doing that. So that is tables. And the final thing to say about tables is do not use them for formatting. As we saw with that list earlier, that was made from a table with one column of ticks and one column of what should have been list items. And that's not the point. When assistive technology encounters tables, it's assuming it's presenting data to a user and that everything above it in the column relates to it and next to it, all the kind of stuff I was saying before. So you're just really going to cause a lot of confusion if you use tables for formatting. And we will look at some other ways of formatting in just a second. But I wonder if there's anything Lucinda wanted to say more around the reading order problem. Is there anything you want to add to that? You're welcome to unmute if that's easier, or add more to the chat.
Frantically trying to find an example. I can't find one yet.
Oh, not to worry. Well, we can come back to it later. But
well, it's basically where we have more text in a table, but it's an easy table of, I don't know, 3 columns with 10 rows. Nothing fancy, but when there's more text in it, when you do the accessibility checking with the word accessibility checker, then often it says that the reading order is not, it comes up as a warning rather than an error, that the reading order is not logical.
Interesting.
But,
okay. It's hard to know. I mean, if you do find an example,
yeah, sorry,
you're welcome to send it over afterwards if that's okay. I don't know if anybody else is. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. It's really hard to kind of picture without seeing the real thing. Yeah. So sorry about that. But yeah, that does sound interesting. I mean, if you follow kind of all the advice that we've just given there, then you shouldn't really be running into those problems. It may you may get a false positive from time to time in those checkers, but we wouldn't generally say you would. They are pretty reliable. So interesting one. Thanks for raising it though.
Thank you. I'll
be interesting if you do find an example. We'll be interested to see it, to be honest, to see if there's something we're missing in this area. So thank you.
Thanks.
Great. Okay, so on to the next thing. So this is where I'm saying about formatting. So I don't use tables for formatting, but columns is one possibility. This might be something you're looking to do. This is where you need to use the built-in columns button, which is under the layout tab in Word. You do, I think, less commonly these days, but you do sometimes see people that will maybe type the first row of this column and then do a tab or lots of spaces and then type the first row of that column and then a new line and you know and so on across, which is not going to give you, like Lucinda was saying, not going to give you a logical reading order, because you're going to read that sentence and then that sentence and then that sentence. So that's not that doesn't make sense, obviously. So if you use the columns tool and you set how many columns you want for each part of your document, it's going to read down the column, then down that column, then this wide one here, and then down those three, and so on. And that's actually going to make sense. And just as a caveat here, I did say earlier, don't do justification if you can avoid it. Do keep things left aligned, because it can be quite hard for people to read with things like dyslexia. When you've got these big white gaps, it can be really problematic for some people. So although I guess that's been done to really show you the exact locations of the columns, we wouldn't recommend that. We'd recommend left aligned wherever possible. So yeah, use that columns button. And there's lots of things like columns that we say you should use the word functionality for, but text boxes is a rare example where we would say not to. Don't use text boxes. In short, is the point of this slide really. Text boxes can cause problems with reading order. They can be very difficult for screen reader users to actually access the contents of text boxes. So I'll just show you in my let's go to my accessible document. Here we go. I'll show you an example of how you can achieve a similar effect, but without using text boxes. So let me just break this out into a new paragraph to give us something to work with. So this is now just a paragraph. It's not in a text box, it's in the kind of flow of the document. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to select that and I'm going to go to borders here, and I'm going to give it an outside border, which you can mess with further if you want it to be a different color or something like that. And I'm going to give it shading as well. Let's give it a really pale color, of course, for contrast reasons. Go with a sort of yellowy color there. And that now looks a lot like a text box, but it isn't one. It's still in the flow of the document. And that's what's really important in order to make the content of it accessible to all users, basically. It needs to be there, it needs to be in the flow of the document. So yeah, in short, don't use text boxes, but you can apply formatting. Table of contents, this is a really useful one. And this is actually, it's all part of this kind of ecosystem of where all these things that we advise that you do, they can all kind of feed into each other in a positive way. So where we've advised you to get that structure, right, just switching back again, where you've got this structure, in fact, I'll demonstrate this as well. So you've got that structure there that you've created with all your headings. And that means now that when you go into, is it references? I always forget where table of contents live. Yes, so under references, table of contents, and you can just pick one of the built-in styles. You can create your own, you can get carried away with all that, but for now let's just pick an automatic one. And it automatically will create all the right page numbers, all the headings, all nested in nicely in the structure there. They're all links that take you to the document, to the part of the document. It's just fully automatic, and you can update that as you update your document, and it will add more headings and update the page numbers and so on. And that's all automatic, but it is also adding more accessibility to a document by providing that additional way to navigate it. So yeah, thoroughly recommend adding those. Oh, so that somebody needs to be let in. There we go. Yeah, so we'd always recommend adding table of contents to your document. File name and title. This is very small, very quick thing, but very easy to overlook. It's quite kind of buried away in Word, unfortunately. This is an important one for accessibility, particularly if you're going to convert to PDF as well, because this will be carried over to the PDF and it is required to be accessible. So this is where you need to give a descriptive title to your file. The file name, of course, matters as well. People will see that, so you want that to describe your file. But I guess that's kind of more likely to do so because you're going to see that yourselves when you're saving it. But if I go back into my Word document and I go into the info, I can see over here I've got accessibility demonstration document as the title there. Typically, this would be likely to be the same as your heading level 1 from within your document. In this case, mine's slightly different, but the important thing is that does describe the purpose, the function of your document, if you like. What is your document? What does it exist? Why does it exist? So yeah, make sure that you've set that the info in the file tab. So that brings us to the end of the whistle-stop tour of all the key things to do in Word. We've got a couple more things to talk about as well, and then PDFs. But yeah, so Word accessibility golden rules we've kind of summarised here. You want to use the formatting tools to provide a meaningful structure with built-in headings and styles, and use a lot of that built-in functionality apart from text boxes. Ensure that meaningful non-text content like images has that text alternative. How would you describe this on the phone, if at all? If not, decorative. And do not use colour alone to communicate information. Make sure there's an alternative means to perceive it, and also be mindful of that colour contrast that we talked about as well. So yeah, those are some good golden rules. Now, I know Lucinda mentioned the accessibility checker. That's good to know that people are aware of this. Not everyone is, and if any of you aren't, then here it is. Welcome to the accessibility checker, which I hope you'll all make great use of going forward. So the thing to say with the accessibility checker, this is built into Office. It may be in slightly different locations depending on the version, but I'm on the latest Office 365, I think it's called now, isn't it? And yeah, this is really, really good. It's not perfect because no automated checker can ever be perfect for accessibility, because they can't know, for instance, if your alt text makes sense, if it is what you would say on the phone about it, or they can't know if your structure is correct either. They can't know if actually that heading that you've put at level 3 belongs inside that level 2, or actually it should be at level 2 itself. It can't know that kind of thing, but it can still find a lot of things. And if there's one thing you do, and it's using this going forward and telling all your colleagues to use this going forward, then that's going to make a huge step change in your levels of accessibility. So we thoroughly recommend using this. So if I switch over to my, well, let's do the inaccessible Word document. That'll give us plenty of results, won't it? So if I go to review and I go to check accessibility, and I just pick that first option there and run it. Oh yes, look, we've got loads of errors because we've got lots of pictures that don't have alt text. That's one of those ticks over there, doesn't have alt text. So I can either mark it as decorative with one click, or I can add a description with another. It does have that, it does have that generator description for me there as well, which is, yeah, as I say, a little bit unreliable, but it could be a starting point. So lots of things there. Images and objects that aren't in line. This is a bit like the alt text problem that, sorry, not the alt text, the text box problem that I was mentioning earlier. They can end up not in line, and that's problematic. Problems with table cells as well there, and this even picks up on that contrast as well. So as I say, it's worth checking these things when you're doing them yourself, but this will pick up on most situations where the contrast is inadequate. It wouldn't manage it within images and things like that, but it would, mostly for text, it would do a good job of spotting those. So yeah, totally worth having this. And there is an option here now to keep accessibility checker running while I work, and that's down here on the bottom of your Word window then, which you can also right click on and turn it on in here as well, accessibility checker. And that's a really good little check, a bit like the spell check icon. You know, have I done everything I can, or everything it can detect anyway, to make this accessible? So that kind of brings us to the end of Word. There's a little bit more of Word that's going to pop up in here in a minute. But if there's any last questions on Word before I move on to PDFs, do shout now if you'd like to, or we can catch up at the end. All good. Okay. Right. Well, in that case, let's have a quick drink. Let's have a look at PDFs then. So PDF accessibility is a bit of an art, a bit of a science and an art, I suppose. It can be quite a challenge. They can be scanned documents, for instance, and those are really difficult. That's where you get into the whole world of, is it real text? If not, it's going to need OCR. They require accessibility tags to be in them to be accessible. They don't often have, oh, we've got a quick question here, sorry. Do you recommend making changes as you go along with the document, or is it easier to make all the accessibility changes at the end? I would say do the accessibility from the start. It's almost always easier at the outset to build the accessibility in as you go, not least because it's going to be fresh in your mind, what you're writing, what you're doing, what you're, you know, when you grab an image and put it in the document, you know at that moment why you're doing that. So it's really easy for you to then do the alt text on it because you know what the purpose of putting it in there was. Maybe you were in the middle of making the case that your school's really improved, and that's why you put that grade chart in there, so you can, you know, big up the fact that over half your students got grade A in the alt text, because that was kind of the point. That was where you were going with that argument at that point. Whereas later you might come back to it and you might have to reread what the purpose was, and that's just an alt text example. But the same goes for a lot of other things. While you're amid the content and writing the content, that's the time to do it really, where possible. And some things are just easier to do at the time as well. If you start trying to retrofit a heading structure at the end, that's always going to be a little bit more difficult than if you kind of set out and do that to start with. So yeah, great question. Thanks, Richard. So yeah, sorry, on PDFs. They don't have great usability on mobile. I guess a lot of us have struggled with PDFs on mobile, whether we have accessibility needs or not. They typically are designed for, you know, sort of A4 printouts, aren't they? So if you're looking at them on a much smaller sized item, you're going to be doing a lot of swiping around, scrolling around, that kind of thing. So it can be quite difficult, and they actually don't have great support on mobile screen readers at this time. They're not fully supported, so it can be difficult. Certain types of content, I'm guessing probably most people here don't need to publish much mathematical and scientific notation, but who knows? So yeah, that kind of stuff isn't very well supported in PDFs at all. And making PDFs accessible does require paid software, which is the Acrobat Pro, which I know not too many of you have. So that's some of the challenges. And there are some sort of additional requirements as well around that metadata, making sure the content is tagged at all, and yeah, making sure the permissions are set correctly as well. There's a strange permission you can end up with on PDFs that just stops them being accessible completely, which is quite annoying that exists, but there you go. So yeah, there's a few things to look for with PDFs. We do a full PDF webinar, as you might imagine, which lasts 2 hours. So as you can imagine, you're not getting much of that today in the remaining 20 minutes, but yeah, we'll touch on a few of the important things. And of course, the most important thing, particularly for all of you who've come to learn about Word today, is when it comes to exporting Word to accessible PDF. Because there's a number of ways that you can start with your Word document, you can end with a PDF document, but there's certain ways of doing that that can give you a completely inaccessible document, even if you've done everything right in Word, which would be a real shame. So let's have a quick look at this. If I go into my accessible Word document, here we go, let's do it from this one. So there's a few ways of doing this. I'll tell you the way not to do it first, just to get that out of the way. Don't touch the print button. If you go in print, you're going to find probably a couple of options for printing to PDF, Microsoft, and maybe Adobe if you've got the Adobe Acrobat software. But that, if you think about what printing is, it kind of makes sense. Printing is just putting an image of your document onto a piece of paper, isn't it? And this is much like that. It's kind of making an image of your document as a PDF. So that's not going to carry across almost anything you've done to make your document accessible. But then beyond that, you've got a couple of other ways. There's Save as Adobe PDF, which you might find you've got if you've got Acrobat. And that's generally pretty good. There's some options to tick to make sure it carries across tagging and headings and bookmarks and things like that. But what we're going to focus on today is the option that everyone's got, that's got Word, or at least a recent enough version of Word, and that's Save a Copy. So we're going to go into Save a Copy, or it could be called Save As, depending on your version. And we're going to choose PDF from the drop down here, but we're going to go into more options. And these options should stick in future, but it's worth checking them at least once a day or something if you're doing a lot of PDFs, or every so often, just to make sure they have stuck. So we're going to go into the Options button. And this is where the important things to check for are. So the most important thing of all is document structure tags for accessibility. That needs to be ticked. If you don't tick that, then all your hard work tagging headings and lists and all the stuff we've talked about today, basically, it's not going to carry across to the PDF. None of it will at all. So always make sure that's ticked. Thoroughly recommend, particularly for a longer document, but ideally for any document really, create bookmarks using headings. And that's that thing, a bit like we saw with the table of contents, but it's going to create a little navigation pane in Acrobat that people can use if they wish to. And document properties worth copying across as well. That's where things like that title that we set earlier and maybe language properties as well, I think, will come across. So effectively, all the stuff about include non-printing information, you want that all enabled. The rest of this stuff, I don't think has a great deal of impact on accessibility, so don't worry about it. But the include non-printing information, really important. And then you just hit save and it will create you an accessible PDF. Now I already have an accessible PDF, so I won't waste its time creating me another one. But yeah, that's the really important way of exporting. And like I say, if you do have Acrobat, you can do it the other way as well, but just don't do print. That's the most important thing there. And those options are kind of summed up in the slides that were sent around as well. For checking PDFs, now this is some of this stuff you can use without paid software and without Acrobat, which is great. So if you do want to give your own PDF a sort of lightweight check before you send it on to be published or whatever else, you can do that with some of these for free. TAC 2021 is quite a good one. It's a little bit of a, I don't know, I think it's a little bit geeky looking software, but it's straightforward enough once you're into it. So that's a free piece of software you can download from the link that's in the slideshow when it comes around. And that it's a PDF accessibility checker, I think it stands for. And you can drop a PDF file onto it. And there is, I think my favorite feature in there that I'd recommend is called screen reader simulation or screen reader view or something like that. And that will actually break down your content of your specific document that you've dropped on there into things like headings and lists and stuff like that, just to show you the content and the order it appears in and all that kind of stuff, and give you a real basic feel for how is the content of my visual PDF actually translating in terms of its meaning and its content. And I find that a really useful, quick visual check of, yeah, that looks broadly what I would expect. Good. There's other stuff here, some of it's paid, some of it's add-ons for paid software, that kind of stuff. But yeah, plenty of tools around for this stuff. But as the big box says at the bottom there, and like I said before with the Word checker, there are still manual checks that will be required. But at least if you've done these checks, you're in a good place for those. And yeah, a lightweight PDF check, these are some of the kind of things you could be looking for. So running them through one of those checkers that I just mentioned, some of the biggest kind of red flags, I suppose, is if it flags up that it's an image only file, that's maybe where it's been scanned in. And it will need what's called OCRing, optical character recognition, which is where it turns scans of text into what we talked about earlier, real text, searchable text. And no tags, that's the absolute worst case scenario for accessibility. That means that there's no tagging at all in your document. And that will need loads of remediation and be a real problem. So you don't want to get to that position, and that's why you want to do everything right in Word in the first place and tick that box when you're exporting. And permissions affecting accessibility, it will flag up if there are any of those. We don't need to get into them today, but it will, you know, any reliable checker will flag that kind of thing up. Tab through the file as well, just open it up, hit your tab key on your keyboard, and you should see a little focus indicator will jump from one link to another or from one form field to another, whatever else you may have in your document. And that way you can make sure that everything's, you know, available to keyboard users. You can also use, there's something called reflow, and this is something that will enable people to maybe zoom the text bigger and that kind of stuff. But the purpose of it here is to show that the order of your text is as you would expect it to be. So if I think I've just about got time to show you this, let's quickly go over to this one. So this is from my accessible document. So we would expect the reading order of this to be quite good. And if I go to view, zoom, reflow, it's now kind of made it reflow a bit like a Word document or a web page does. So I'm just zooming in here. And you'll see it's not going off the sides. I'm not having to scroll around this A4 sheet anymore because it's all reflowed, as it says. But the good thing, the reason why you would do this when you're testing is to see, is the order still what I would expect the order to be? Now it's not in the visual layout anymore. And yeah, it is. Look, the heading's still at the top and the paragraph and so on. So that looks, you know, pretty good. So let's take it back out of reflow mode. Can be a little buggy at times, reflow mode, as we said. Oh yeah, there's a good example. It's just hidden half my document now. Love to see it. Oh well. Just pretend that's still there. You could just close and reopen it or something if that happens. But yeah, a little bit buggy at times, the old reflow. But it will give you that feel for the view, the order. And the other thing you can do around the reading order is file, export to, text, accessible. Now, if I do that, this will, yeah, you can see I did this earlier when I was checking it still worked, and it does. There we go. So that's opened into Notepad, which I mentioned earlier, because Notepad only supports plain text. So anything you can see in Notepad, you know it's text, it's real text. And this again is showing me the order of all the text from my document, and that's a really good quick check of is that order what I would expect it to be. So that's quite a good quick way to do it. Might not be quite as quick if you're dealing with a 100-page document, but nevertheless, it gives you a good feel. And yeah, there's just a quick example there of what can happen. It turns out in this PDF, there's loads of random hidden text there that it's not obviously visible in the visual PDF, but it's come up in that text export. So that's an example of the kind of issue that might throw up. So those are a few of the checks that you can do without having paid software. But I say without having paid software, don't quote me on that on one or two of those export things in Adobe. I'm not totally sure what the boundary is. They do move it around sometimes. But yeah, most of the stuff we just talked about, you don't need paid software for. Acrobat Pro, if you do have that, this is where you can get into more in-depth checking and testing and all that kind of stuff, which we will not get into in any depth today, other than to just quickly demonstrate the kind of thing I'm talking about with that. So if I go to my untagged PDF, here it is, looks the same visually, and this is in fact, yeah, I can compare the difference here as well. So on the left-hand side, you can find accessibility tags. This is only in Acrobat Pro, or if you've used it before, there'll be a button for it there already. And in this file, you can see no tags available, and you can see that in the document properties as well. Tagged PDF, no, and that's that red flag I mentioned earlier. That means this is really going to be a badly inaccessible document, whereas the other one, it's got loads of lovely tags here, so we can see that the heading is a heading 1 and the list is a list with list items in it. It's got, you don't have to know what they all mean, but you can get the gist, that those are all nicely tagged. And yeah, this one has no tags, so that's a real problem. So yeah, just to say this is fixable in Acrobat, but it takes a lot of time and work. You would use what's called the reading order tool. You could then select, for instance, that and say that needs to be a heading 1, and you'll see the tags start to appear then. So we do now have a tag in this document, which is better than no tags, not as good as lots of them. That could be a paragraph and so on. So you can remediate it. It is possible to remediate it, but it's a lot of work. And the really big problem, and this is where you all come in with your Word work, is that if you do that, you can make a wonderful, perfectly accessible PDF, brilliant, publish it. Then someone comes to you and said, actually, I need to change one word in that document, and I've changed it in Word, and I've exported my PDF again. And then they have to start again because they're back to square one and they've got to do all the work again. So that's why, and this kind of relates back to Richard's question as well. You want to get it done as early as possible in the process, because the earlier you do it, the less problems you have if you're trying to change things later. And yeah, the real last resort is to try and fix this stuff in Acrobat at the end. Yeah, much more important to get it right in Word in the first place. So the final thing to talk about today, very briefly, is forms, accessible forms. I should just pause actually and just check if anyone had any questions around the Acrobat Pro stuff there and the checking. But at this point, it might be as well to just round the questions up at the end, I guess, in case people need to be getting going promptly at the end. But any burning thoughts? All good? Okay, right, let's carry on. So accessible forms. Now, obviously in this webinar, we're talking Word and PDF. So there's a few things to say about the sort of pros and cons here. Word forms, I don't know how many of these are still around at your council. I know there were certainly still some around at the one I worked at before. This is the kind of thing where historically it would have been printed out. It's maybe got a load of full stops in it for people to sign their name on, or some underlines, or just a gap or something. Those forms, they're not very accessible, as perhaps you might imagine. particularly if you do try and get a bit more advanced with it and you start looking at the form controls that are in Word, things like drop downs and input fields and buttons and stuff like this, they have very limited accessibility. They won't actually work for a lot of assistive technology at all. So we would definitely not recommend using those more advanced kind of controls. Also, you may see documents where people have kind of tried to protect most of the text and just leave gaps for people to fill in, and those are the only bit that's editable. Unfortunately, what that typically means is that assistive technology can't get to any of the protected text at all. So they're just left with all the blank bits, which really not very helpful. So the short version of how to make an accessible Word form is A, maybe don't, or B, just basically make your Word form like a normal Word document and just literally leave a gap for someone to put text in. And I don't mean a gap full of full stops or a gap full of underscores. I mean just literally a gap. So, or even blank lines. You don't really want more than one blank line for a gap either. You just want to say name colon and then a new line and then address colon, and then people can just type it after those things. So that's, yeah, it sounds a bit hacky, and it kind of is a bit hacky, but that's the most accessible kind of Word form you can have. So you may see where this is going, but let's just talk about PDF forms. So PDF forms, you can actually make accessible PDF forms. They do need to be tagged and done in certain specialist kind of ways. It can be done in InDesign, but it can't really be done in Word up front. Oh yeah, question about the border and color for the area that needs to be filled in. Yeah, you could do that. You know, with caveats around contrast and that kind of stuff. Are we talking around? So we're looking at Word forms here, I guess. So we're talking about those gaps that I was talking about. So someone says name and then there's a gap, and you want to have a border and color around that. Oh yeah, I can't see any harm in giving that paragraph that format in the way we did earlier when we were talking about text boxes. That would be okay. But yeah, as I'll come to in a minute, basically Word forms, it's not ideal in a number of ways, but yeah, certainly if you want to have that kind of formatting, then that's the way to do it. Really, is how we looked at with text boxes earlier. So yeah, so PDFs, yeah, you can make accessible forms. They require, in fact, I'll just jump ahead to the next slide because they require these kind of things to be set up. So anybody who does have Acrobat and does want to do this, you need to make sure that every field has a tooltip, which is a very misleading name because a tooltip traditionally is just that little thing that pops up if you hover your mouse over something. But in Adobe Forms terms, the tooltip is the most important thing for accessibility. It's the actual name of the field that users will hear or perceive through their assistive technology. So it must have that tooltip there, even though, as you'll notice on the screenshot there's a box called name directly above it, but for some reason that's not the one Adobe went with for the accessible name. They went with tooltip. So yeah, confusing, but there you go. So yeah, that's one of the most important things to do. And you want to make sure you've chosen the right kind of form control, a button or a tick box or drop downs, things like that. And you also want to make sure that the tab order matches the kind of visual or logical order of the form in your PDF. So in this case, this has been dragged around until, you know, the name field's first, then the address and state and whatever else. At the moment, it looks to me like radio button 6 needs a better name. That doesn't mean very much, does it? But yeah, so that gives you a feel for the tab order there. So those are the things to keep in mind if you are making an accessible PDF form, and that is covered off in our other PDF course if anybody does want to get more involved in that side of things. So yeah, you can make a more accessible form in PDF. If you're doing that from a Word background, you would want to, when I say leave a gap, I mean leave a gap into which you're going to insert the form fields in Adobe, so a visible gap in the Word document, and then that's going to be replaced by the form fields. So where I was going with all that, really, particularly in relation to the Word forms, which, as you'll have gathered, are not great, is that if you can migrate your forms to proper online web forms, that's the way to go, really. There's things like Microsoft Forms, which should come as part of your kind of Office package if you've got that at the council. Or Google Forms would be another option, or things like SurveyMonkey. You do need to keep GDPR in mind because the data that people submit through these forms is then held by these companies that you're, you know, the forms are provided by. But particularly with something like Microsoft Forms, that's probably covered by your general GDPR around all your Word documents and things like that anyway, if you're storing them on SharePoint or something. So yeah, Microsoft Forms is not a bad solution. I would say like none of these are probably going to score absolute 100% best gold standard accessibility, but they're pretty good. They're not bad at all, and they're certainly better than trying to do kind of hacky Word-based forms, and certainly easier to set up than PDF forms as well. So that's our general advice around forms, is to switch to online ones. And actually for end users of all kinds, it tends to be easier to fill in forms online that are kind of designed to be filled in online. So we've reached the summary slide, which is not bad at 11:26. There you go. So yeah, accessibility requirements do apply to all digital documents. So always consider if information needs to be in another format, or if it could be presented as HTML. I did say, you know, that's one of the more accessible formats. So if you can provide things on your website as part of the website, that's better than having to do them in Word documents and PDFs. But you know, it does depend on your needs and your users' needs. And yeah, make sure you're using the semantic styles, things like headings and lists. Consider color accessibility, whether that's distinguishing between colors or making sure there's contrast. And yeah, touching back on Richard's question again, make sure that accessibility is implemented at the source. The earlier in the process you can, the better. But particularly make sure you do it in Word. Don't leave it till the PDF, because that's going to create big headaches, particularly if there's amendments to be done later. So yeah, you want to have a good process around that. And ensure you have a clear accessibility documents policy as well, and good templates. We touched on templates earlier on. If you can try and make the templates for your organization as a whole be good, it should be possible. If anyone here knows anyone in IT or is from IT, it should be possible to overwrite what's called the normal template file on everyone's computers with a more accessible version. So if someone wants a little side project to get a more accessible template up and running, maybe with more on-brand styles for your headings and things like that, that should be possible. So things like that can be done, and make sure you've got those procedures as well. Anything that's getting published online or distributed, make sure that's getting checked at some point. And I'll just flash ahead to say there are some more resources at the end of the slideshow, which will come around to you. So you can look forward to clicking those links later. But now I will take breath, take a drink, and say, has anyone got any last questions? Stunned you all into silence. It's a lot of content. I'm sorry, it's been a bit of a marathon morning, but I hope it's all been useful. And yeah, don't forget, of course, you can always watch it back at your own pace later. Slow me down to 0.5 times or something. No problem, thank you. That's great. I can see someone's unmuted. Did you have a question or comment? No? Okay, well, I won't hold you all up for an additional 1 minute of your time. You can generously have that back. But thank you all for coming. It's been, yeah, it's been really good to see you all as well, to be able to see you all. It's nice when people have their cameras on. It feels more human. So thank you very much. And yeah, I'm glad to see I'm getting some nice feedback there. Thank you very much. And yeah, take care. Enjoy the rest of your day, and hope the storm doesn't get you all. And yeah, I will stop recording now as well. I can work out how.
Thank you. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks, everybody. Lovely to meet you all.
Thanks, Paul. Cheers.